We'll announce as well that we have established on Saturday the 21st, we'll pick up food at Durham's Grocery. I don't know, 8 o'clock, I'm sure it'll be sometime in 8:30. So that'll be Saturday the 21st. The evening of Saturday the 22nd. And hopefully, if Susan is available for us, we might be able to take it to the school Sunday night, the 22nd. If not, we'll have to do it on Monday, the 23rd. So that's what she wanted. And so that's what we'll do. But we'll let you know more about that. That's not this week, though, but that's the next week. Okay. Everybody's going to have to eat a lot more chicken strips to get to free the boxes up. So, yes. Sure. Absolutely. 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 Well, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, we are going to tie together a couple of things that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, we spent some time talking about, we mentioned Martin W. Stone and a few other people. In many ways, we were talking about how that the church, the word Christian being applied, began to be restored kind of in our neck of the woods in Kentucky and West Virginia and Ohio and Tennessee. And then last week, we talked about Thomas Campbell and Alexander Campbell. I think I've got am I backwards? Is that the order we went in? All right. It's like I can't remember what I've seen. But we talked about them and how they had taught in West Virginia and some other places as well. And so I wanted to make a point to start with that I've tried to mention a few times is that all of these things are sort of happening in various places. There was never a set time where one person sat down and said, we have to fix this. And the other 8 billion people in the world said, we'll let him or her take care of that. It was movements around the world, but more particular in the United States, where people were looking at religion and questioning if they were doing it the right way. Questioning if what they were teaching was correct. And we talked about how when Alexander Campbell had a child, when his wife had a child, and then they were going to sprinkle the child, that's when it sort of clicked for him that he had been teaching that they needed to fix that as well. So I say all that because you'll notice on the title there this evening, it says the Stone-Campbell Convergence. Okay. And so to converge means to bring together. And as with almost any merger, not everybody is going to agree on everything. One of the things that you were probably told before you got married was that when you marry, it was for better and then period, right? And that was it, right? For better or what? For worse, all right? And then the for worse was bolded and underlined and, broadcast prominently, right? So for better is the easy part, right? When there's something that you agree on, that's pretty easy. But the for worse part, maybe when you don't agree on things, that makes it a little more complicated. Every one of you, when your spouse has said, what would you like to eat? You give an answer immediately, and they say, yep, that's exactly what I want to eat too, right? It's not that way. Y'all must be different than me. So Mary's not here. She can't refute that, I guess. But usually we have disagreements, right? Even if we agree on lots of things, then there's also some disagreements. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening, is that the Stone-Campbell Convergence would be something of a rocky move as well. I want to talk about a couple of things. We've got a few scriptures that we'll read here for us this evening. But if you look here to start with, there were certainly differences between these groups. And that's going to be very clear from the get-go this evening. But there were enough similarities that a union was possible. Okay? Think about it this way. There are people that you could probably work with and get along with without any difficulty, right? But there are probably some people that it would be really hard. You just have nothing in common. Well, as we've talked about over the course of these lessons, there was all this moving, all of this breaking, all of this dividing that kept happening. And in many cases, some groups grew farther apart. Some groups started to grow a little closer together. We talked last week about the Campbell reformers, and they had mostly broke off from the Baptists, and in particular broke off with the idea of creeds, but also how baptism was done and what you had to be, sort of the process of baptism, as it were. It was fortunate for both of these that was in, like I said, this sort of area. It would be really hard in 1810 to share something from California and New York. It just wasn't feasible. But if people lived close to each other, that made movement a little bit easier as well. And Campbell had visited Stone in Georgetown, Kentucky, and he heard preachers focusing on these three things. And so when Campbell comes to Georgetown, where Stone lived, these three things: faith, repentance, and baptism. And I would imagine that you've probably heard all three of those mentioned numerous times in the church setting as well, right? You probably don't go to many services where the word faith doesn't come up, right? Where repentance doesn't come up. Where we talk about, making mistakes and needing to change, and then also baptism as well. And so all of these shared enough that it was worthy of perhaps uniting. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about similarities to start with, and then we're going to talk about differences. Dumb question, but when things are similar, that means what? What's alike about them, all right? So similarities between the two movements right here. Both claimed that the scripture was what they were basing things on. That was the sole authority for their faith. And they said that there would be no need for creeds, no need for statements, no need for documents beyond the Bible that would bind the church together. Now, let's read this for just a second. This is Ephesians chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Lucille, do you care to read this one? Now, I sort of stripped this verse away, but I really wanted to look at this three words right here. What are these three words? When you read. So the teaching and the understanding falls on who? On us, right? On us as a Christian. You can certainly be taught, and I would imagine almost everybody is taught. But if I'm teaching you, or if somebody is teaching someone else, or if you're teaching someone else, if you don't let them read from here, you can say anything you want, right? And if I can say anything that I want, and you are going to believe it wholeheartedly, it's not too many steps till I can corrupt that, right? It says right here on page 653 that you are to give the preacher $500 every time you come to church. I'm not going to let you see it, but it's there, right? Well, that's a broad example, but if you don't read it, could that be the case? Now, that's, again, a silly example, but there's all sorts of teachings that could be taught. But if you say, let me see that, well, then I've got to show you where that is. And either A, I'm pulled out as a liar, or B, I'm maybe taking something out of context, or I'm doing something, teaching something perhaps the wrong way. And so this verse, just because I wanted to see this, when you read. Dad and I were talking about this last weekend, and Dad said he was talking about how that when people started to read and study for themselves, they started to ask questions. They started to say, I'm not sure if it's always, if this is the way that it should be. That's what the Bible was for. A couple of other similarities that we have right here, and I apologize, they're a little smaller, but had to fit them all up here. But the same thing there is there with this desire for unity. This desire. How often do we see in the Bible God, Jesus or the apostles say things like there was a need for unity? Don't be separated from each other. It's over and over again. But what almost immediately happens in Christianity? Division, right? And why do people divide? Go all the way back or go not as far back. Why do people divide? Their way. Selfishness. Well, I know what it says, but that maybe doesn't benefit me as much, so I'm going to change this. Well, when I say that, Don disagrees. All of a sudden, we've split apart. And half the people will go with Don, half's going to go with me. But guess what happens? The half that go to Don, guess what they're going to do a little bit later? It'll split again if you're not careful, right? And so there was this desire for unity, but the unity would be based upon what it said in the Bible. Both reacted against a couple of things: Calvinistic theology, mostly the idea of original sin, of Presbyterianism, and they denied doctrines such as predestination, meaning that your fate was previously sealed. In its simplistic term, fate was previously sealed. So they denied some of these teachings, and we've talked about this, that a lot of the early Americans had come out of Presbyterianism as well. They rejected infant sprinkling, and they both practiced immersion of believers. That was not an easy step to get to. It took a while. It took some practical application for that to happen. Both taught that there was some relation between baptism and the forgiveness of sins. And I want you to notice that. Is there anything about that that seems a little odd? Some. But I told you that whenever the two groups come together, it's not always a smooth happening, right? We'll get to that a little bit more in a second. Both refused to put on names that they deemed unscriptural. They did not belong to groups such as Presbyterian synods or any other associations, although that associations will become a complicated thing next week, but we'll not talk about that this evening. All right. I want to talk tonight about differences. The similarities are there, but I want to look at differences, and I think we have 4 differences that we're going to look at this evening. I would encourage you, if you have questions, to certainly ask them as well. Let's talk about names first. And I want to say, I put 2 logos up here on the screen. These are modern logos of those religious groups. They didn't really exist at the time, but I needed something for you to be able to see what it was. So the Campbell movement, often called reformers, preferred to be called disciples, or more specifically, disciples of Christ. Let's talk about that name for a second. Is that a fitting name for someone as a Christian? Absolutely. Are you a disciple? What does the word disciple mean? A follower, right? So you can be a disciple of anything, right? You can follow you're a disciple of your favorite sports team or your favorite movie star, or whatever it might be. You are going to watch every movie that they're in. That's a fitting term. What about the more specific disciples of Christ? Is that a fitting name? Well, yeah, I mean, if we're going to be a disciple of anything, it's probably better to be a disciple of Christ than a disciple of, UK basketball or something like that. So these are names that was fitting. And so the word reformers was what they were often called, but disciples or disciples of Christ were the name that they preferred. Campbell, when I say Campbell tonight, it's Alexander. Thomas is pretty much gone by this time. But Campbell believes that disciples was a more ancient term. Okay. He said it was more descriptive, more scriptural, and more unappropriated right there. All right, let's think about this for a second. How is disciples an ancient and scriptural term? Mm-hmm. Jesus' followers were called what? They're disciples, right? And you'll read that his disciples went here or there and came to him or whatever it might would be. Sure. So in many ways, again, the word ancient that we used here, the idea of sort of dialing back to something old. Now, I said this is the image of the Christian church, Disciples of Christ logo. This would be what you would see on a sign or something like that today. It was a term that would have been used, but again, you wouldn't have seen an image such as this. Now, what do you think the second picture is going to be? You're right. It's not Church of Christ, right? Not Church of Christ, but I use the word Christian. This is just my picture that I found because we don't have a logo for it. But the Stone movement didn't go by disciples, but rather they went by the name Christian. Right? Is that an acceptable name? Certainly so. Christians were first called Christians at Antioch a little bit after Jesus' death, and that name had stuck with. It had been sullied. It had been dirtied up a little bit over time, but that would be an acceptable name for them as well. They wanted Stone and the others use the word Christian at the exclusion of all other names. So when I talk about differences, is there a difference in the name given by the two different groups here? It's different, but it is the same. What does that mean, Don? Okay, so it's different wording, but has the same focus. All right. Any others? Intent and meaning is about the same. All right. So when we look at this, again, we've got groups that are sort of coming from different spots together. All right. So these names. Now, what's in a name? Don't worry, not even a religious aspect. What's in a name? Why are you named what you're named? Identifier. What else?
It helps not only just identify, but give the purpose.
All right. So it's an identifier. There's purpose added to it. How many of you are named after somebody up the line? Grandma, grandpa, somewhere up the line. Wonder why? Yeah, those people were held in reverence. Those people were held in honor. One of the things that has happened in 20 years of teaching is the names have changed from the students, right? The names have changed. In some of the names that I see, I wonder, will that name carry on or will it go further? But the same thing was said about your name. And think about your name and how many of you have a name that nobody would name their kid today because, they're not going to do it. But I can't tell you how many Graces I have right now. Well, my great-grandmother's name was Grace, and I never knew a soul named Grace other than her and Virgil Horseman's mother were the only two people. But they all sort of circle back here and there. But those names are applied because maybe we have an honor toward someone. We love that person. All of those names work the same way here. Does disciple and Christian fit that same mold? They fit the exact, you're honoring, you're describing, and you're striving, as Ben said there as well. So this is a difference, but not a huge difference. Number 2, pay attention to the picture. Ta-da. All right. See, it was dunked down. No, gosh, nobody got it. All right. Let's go back. Look at the picture again. All right. Watch what happens to the person in the picture. They get pushed down into the water. You all should have said, wow, Dad, that was really impressive. Not a single one of you did. All right. I spent 2 hours working on that the other night. Didn't get a single thing. All right, I'm just kidding. Stone's Christians practiced immersion, but I said there a minute ago, there's some differences. They didn't insist that it was essential to the remission of sins. It was baptism. Now, this dials back to a adding to the church sort of setup right here. Stone, though, later concluded that baptism was associated with the remission of sins. Now, what I want us to see right here is the same thing really that Campbell saw last week. Campbell thought baptism, even though his father thought it even less so, Campbell thought, I don't know if baptism is for the forgiveness of sins or not. But when it was about time to sprinkle his child, that sort of changed his mind. Well, what do you notice right here? What changed the mind of Stone in this reading here? Study. Bible tells us to study for what reason? To show ourselves approved. Why do we study for anything? To learn. All right. Jimmy, you ever not study for a test? No, I don't believe that, Jimmy. Jimmy, they ever put a test in front of you and you said, oh, I didn't study for this at all. So if we want to do well, we need to study on it, right? Well, in this case, Stone, he didn't just say, well, you know what? We're going to merge together. We're going to start grouping with these people, meeting with these people. That's good. We've probably learned enough. This will be fine. He was continually studying. When should you study? Daily. What if you don't understand something? Close it off and say, no. We need to try to study more. And I'm going to take something from Ben because I've heard Ben say this before. But Ben has said before that he's read something 100 times, and the 101st time it reads different. You see something. Well, there are things in Bible, and I'll say this as preparing lessons. There are times when it just doesn't click. And there are times when you need to shut the Bible and walk away for a minute. But when you walk away, do you say, I'm good, the next 40 years are covered? No, sometimes we got to get in the right frame of mind or get into the right place. And I think what we see here with Stone, it was the same thing, is that he needed to study more. He needed to dive a little deeper into it. And they figured out what baptism need to be. Now, Campbell, on the other hand, the disciples, they believed that baptism was absolutely essential to the remission of sins. But that was what we talked about last week. And so the disciples made immersion a requisite, not just for forgiveness of sins, but that's how you became a member of the church. Now, let's talk about member of the church for just a second. Are you a member of the church? Okay. When we think about the word member of something, we tend to think about a group or an organization, right? You might be, in Ben's case, a member of the union that is with his work group, right? You've chosen to be part of that. Well, Ben, I'll ask, how many members are in the union where you work? 300. That's a lot of people, right? There's a lot of people. Well, we choose to be a member of what? The Lord's church, the body, right? But are you the only members of the church? The 30 of us that are in here right now. People are everywhere, right? But it's a choice that is made. Okay? And it's a choice that is made. When you are baptized, you're baptized for the forgiveness of sins. And what else? You become there you go. The Lord adds you to his church. Now, let's say that something comes up with me. Excuse me. And I have to, no, I'm good. Something comes up and my job moves me all the way across the country. I am moving to Oregon. All right. Well, I'm going to find a church that I need to worship in, right? Can I be a member of that church? I would choose that, right? I would place my membership there, whatever the word. Do I need to be rebaptized when I go to that church? I don't. All right. I wouldn't need to. But membership is a term that sometimes can get a little bit tricky for what we're talking about this. But the disciples said you had to be immersed as a requisite for a church member. They didn't say you couldn't worship with them, but you would not be a member without being immersed in baptism. All right.
And the union's a good example. I think that you've got the local that you're a part of a member. When you become part of that local, you're part of the national.
Right. And in many ways, just like at church, the work that you do here locally, you maybe see it, but it's also nice to know that work's being done. You know, when we see work being done all the way around the world, helping other people, that's the same kind of thing. All right. So the third one right here, you don't have to be wild by my picture on this one, but they differed on the Lord's Supper as well. I had some different thoughts. Campbell and the disciples, I'm using Campbell's name, but this group as a whole. And I'm also, let me be fair too. Let me say this. It's also not necessarily everybody that was sort of in that group necessarily believed the same way either. So this is a broad description. But they took communion. The disciples took communion every week. First day of the week, they took communion. The Stone's group of Christians initially didn't do that. They initially didn't do that. That was not uncommon. Do you know anybody who does? Do you know any groups that don't take communion every week? Yeah, you don't have to go very far. Probably more of your friends don't and do beyond the walls of this building. But so initially, the Stone Christians did not. Okay, but Stone was quoted as saying they, which was Campbell's group, the disciples. He said they insisted upon weekly communion, and I like the word that he used right there. He said, "Which we had." What does that word say? What does it mean to neglect? Will? Okay. When do we, let me rephrase the question then here. Are any of you neglecting anything right now? Probably all of us are. Right? Health? Why? All right. All right. Repairs. The other night, I went home and the water was running. And I thought for a minute, I thought, oh, maybe it'll stop. And it's like, that's always how it works, right? It always stops. And so a little bit later, I was like, I'm going to call Dad because I don't think it's going to stop. Absolutely. We have, every couple of weeks, we have department meetings at school, and we always have to bring stuff to present. Usually the day before, like, oh, get this thing ready. We could have done it all the time, but we neglect because I don't worry about that right now. I'll worry about it later. Well, the communion, Stone says they had neglected that. They had just not put the emphasis on communion that perhaps it should have had. Would it be easy to do that even today? Of course it would. You could say, we just did it last week. We talked about it last week. Kevin stood up there and said some really nice things last week. We don't need to talk. It would be easy to fall into neglect on that. All right? I think this is the last one. Last one on differences. The Stone movement preachers stress the emotional side of religion. They encouraged weeping and mourning. That's the quote that I read right there, as they sought salvation. Now think about that for a second. I'll let you fill in that blank. What does weeping and mourning mean? Pour your heart out. All right. All right. Be over the top. It certainly can. Can you think of any scriptural examples of weeping and mourning, or sort of over the top religion, maybe? Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. I was thinking about Jesus talks about the hypocrites. So he said they would disfigure their faces, right? To make it look like what? They would make it look like they'd been fasting, they had been suffering, as what it would be. And so this is something that, that the Stone movement was pushing.
Make the show of it, and you just wait.
Those of you who maybe have preached or led singing, but even if you're in the audience, how many of you have seen somebody walk to the front crying? Anybody ever seen anybody walk to the front smiling? Yeah, I think so. Which one's right and which one's wrong? Neither. If you are so happy to say, I'm going to be baptized right now, you can be grinning from ear to ear. That's a good attitude to have, right? It might be, I have spent 40 years messing up. I need to go fix that. Well, anybody to say how you have to react to something like this. If we're not careful, then it can become sort of an act in what we're doing. And is the heart truly into it or not? Yes, sir.
When you're upset, to not, let on that anything is wrong, because the people that do, they have their just reward.
Mm-hmm. And I hate to make the reference. Teacher, that's what I experienced. A lot of kids, the minute one tiny thing happens, it's the biggest deal that's ever happened in the world. The boy who cried wolf story, right? This is, and then it's like, how do I? And so, I have a little girl that I don't have her this trimester, but I had her last trimester. I had her last year, and every day it was something, and it was like, I don't know how to deal with this, right? I think it's the same thing. Or we have to get ourselves right, but it shouldn't be a show. Don, go ahead. Yes, absolutely. It's not a set precedent for what it would be. On the Campbell side, they emphasize the role of reason in conversion. So this is sort of the mental aspect. Remember, this is just, 100 years or so after the Enlightenment. This is studying. This is thinking. The idea that I have studied, I have figured out what I need to do. This is not an emotional decision. This is a logical decision in what I need to do. It said faith, for here defined as acceptance of the New Testament message that Jesus is the Messiah, was seen as an act of reason more than emotion. I have learned, I know Jesus is, I believe, my faith says Jesus is the Son of God. I need to get into that. It should not be this, that, something else. Now, I don't know which one's right, which one's wrong. Don just said a minute ago, these are individual things, but they both make a pretty good point, right? Our emotions should be there. But how many of you have ever made a poor decision emotionally? Probably all of us, right? We're all tore up about something. I'm going to do this or do that. Well, maybe take a beat and think about it for a second. You can become a Christian when you maybe shouldn't or aren't quite ready to become a Christian yet. That'll sometimes happen, right? So there needs to be a little bit of sort of thought on it. Uh-huh. 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 Mm-hmm. Right. No, you're exactly right. But each person is different. Things move people differently as well. All right. So a couple things here. Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Thomas, you could read this one, sir?